Welcome to another episode of Inside DevOps. I'm your host, John Bristow, and joining me today is Eric Lawrence. I know that some of you who are watching this video say, hey, I know that guy. He's the guy behind Fiddler. You'd be right. Eric is a principal program manager with Microsoft Security. He's specifically a part of the web defense team. Eric, thanks for joining me. I appreciate it.
Awesome to be here.
So you're on the web defense team. Tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. So Web Defense is part of sort of the Microsoft Security business unit. Microsoft has gone from, when you think about security, Microsoft has been doing product security for decades, right? Going back to the trustworthy computing memo in the early 2000s from Bill G saying, hey, the company needs to reorient itself around building more secure products. To now, security is a product category. And so you think about, all of these vendors that sell security solutions for things like, the old ones being antivirus. So now you have lots more things like, endpoint detection and response of, detecting compromised machines and responding to those, and things around reputation of URLs or sites on the internet. Like, is this a phishing site? Is this a malware site? Anti-spam or anti-abuse? Is this a source of malicious content that's coming into my organization? Firewalls, everything else. Security as a business is now a real and quite large business for Microsoft. So Web Defense is a team within the security business unit, and specifically Web Defense is sort of geared around providing intelligence to security products within the company around, the trustworthiness of, aspects of the web. And so most visibly and probably most familiar to folks is SmartScreen. SmartScreen is Microsoft's URL reputation service that has existed since around 2007 or so, around, IE back then and now Edge now. As you're surfing around the internet, we're performing reputation checks so that if you happen to navigate to a phishing site, we'll say, hey, don't enter your creds. This is a bad site. Or if you're downloading a file, we can go and look at that file and say, oh, this is, the 7-zip installer, for example. And even though it's not signed, we know that it's the 7-zip installer. So we're not going to freak out and tell you, oh my gosh, you're downloading something that's not signed and you should be super scared. Versus, hey, you're downloading a new binary that we've never seen before. That's kind of suspicious. Maybe you don't want to run that. Or, literally, this is malware. Don't run it. And so Web Defense is sort of the technology behind things like SmartScreen.
That sounds like a really tough problem. And let me explain why. You're trying to prevent people holding a metaphorical gun from shooting themselves basically all the time. Meaning they're surfing the web and they possibly aren't as technically savvy as maybe you or I. And they are navigating on various websites and clicking and downloading and running things. That sounds like a really hard problem to protect folks against. Am I accurate in that assessment?
For sure. And, I think one of the things that's most interesting to characterize in terms of kind of the evolution of browser security over the years is, in the days of Internet Explorer 6, Internet Explorer 7, your early Internet Explorer 8, the attacks, there were certainly social engineering attacks, there were phishing attacks, there were malware attacks, but the attacks that were interesting to attackers, the things that were getting black hat talks and so forth, were effectively 0 days. You surf to the website, you don't do anything, and your machine gets owned by some bad guy who's running shellcode. And browsers are now much, much better. Certainly the Internet Explorer team and the Windows team invested heavily in providing a set of defenses that made those attacks less practical. And then the Chrome team built upon those with their sandbox. And the sandbox for Chromium is actually very, very good and builds atop many different security primitives in Windows, to the point now where certainly there still are ODate attacks from time to time, but these are not the sorts of things where you have entire millions of computers getting owned at a time, and don't browse the internet today until a patch is out. Like, sometimes you'll still see those headlines because they get lots of clicks, but the reality is that those kinds of attacks are not very common, and the browsers have gotten very good at mitigating those attacks and getting patches out fast against those attacks and so forth. But to your point, the part that's really hard to patch is the user. You can't just download new firmware on the human and say, like, okay, now you're protected against this malicious thing. And so, yes, the user is browsing around, and very often, they are, the weakest link, as it were. because as a bad guy, I can go craft a phishing email that seems reasonably plausible and blast it out to a million people, and my response rate doesn't have to be super high. If only 1% of users fall for that, that's a huge amount of data. And now, of course, people are all excited about, oh, I can go get Chat GPT to write my phishing email for me. And it wasn't actually the case that writing phishing emails was particularly challenging before, but certainly if you weren't a native English speaker, maybe it was a little bit harder. And so certainly, like the attacker techniques are, pretty low barrier to entry, and so that means that basically we need to protect the user, and what that entails is having intelligence about where people are going, what they're doing, and helping guide them toward the correct decisions. And that's a science in of itself, right? If we know a site is malicious, um, can we get the user to respect the fact that we know that it's malicious? And that was one of the things that in the early days, a lot of this security technology, it wasn't really well understood, and we didn't really understand how people would behave in the face of these warnings. And so I remember we had a bunch of meetings when we first did Smart Screen or the phishing filter in Internet Explorer, where we had a bunch of UX, and we had some folks in the team who were like, "Yeah, I don't know that that's going to be effective. Like my kids are like wild teenagers, and you're saying it's dangerous. That sounds exciting. Like I'm going to click through that. I want to see what's dangerous. Yeah." And so that stuff is now fairly well studied, and the Chrome usable security team has tons of PhDs that do studies about like, hey, is this blocking page effective? And there's now a lot more telemetry around how people interact with these security warnings. But yeah, this is the reason I've been working on security stuff. I was working on the phishing filter back in Internet Explorer 7 days, 2006, 2007, and here it is 2023, and I'm still working on phishing. And so I've done a couple other things in between then, but nobody solved the problem while I was away either.
It's a hard problem though, because I think phishing, it takes advantage of the weakest link, to your point. Like I actually enjoy watching those YouTube videos where you see people who kind of run the scam sort of phishing attempts inside of a sort of a virtual machine. And so they put on voice masks and stuff, and they basically pwn the person that's trying to pwn them. I remember one time, this was when I was at Microsoft. I think this was like 2008 or so. One of those calls came into my house claiming they were from Microsoft, and I was at Microsoft at the time, and so it got quite funny. Actually, I'm like, I have an employee number. Do you have an employee number? I can look you up right now in the gal. Like, tell me what you're like, because he was claiming to be from Microsoft, and he was like, "Sir, don't claim to be part of Microsoft. You're not part of Microsoft." I'm literally looking at my employee badge right now. Like, you
Yep.
don't tell me you're from Microsoft. This is clearly a scam. Um, okay, so Smart Screen, obviously get it, but and I understand the sort of mitigations that you're trying to enforce, but I always see it as like an arms race. Like you're fighting basically an ever and growing attack surface area relative to sites that like anyone with an IP address and a web domain can basically fire these things up, and they're getting really crafty at these domains. Like they're using variants of well-known TLDs, or they're using well-known domain names, etc., and they're able to basically thwart that last layer of defense, which is the person's brain. And to your point
Yep.
about not having a firmware upgrade for people, I guess. But
Yep.
how do you possibly, where do you begin? Like I would be in the camp of, where do we start? Like I don't even know how to help.
There's so many different things that we can do. Some of it's new tech, some of it's old tech. Some of it is around helping the human make better decisions. The best tech, in my opinion, is stuff that makes humans not have to make decisions. And so one of the things that is not directly in my purview, but in my old domain in Edge, the browser, there's been an evolution of something that's now called passkeys. So you may remember things like WebAuthn and FIDO2 security tokens and all this nerd stuff, but now it's been renamed to a much more accessible thing called passkeys. And that's kind of the evolution of these technologies to the point where now, humans aren't going to have a password. You can't phish something if the human doesn't know it. And that's, a great argument for using a password manager with a uniquely generated password. If you don't know your password, you can't get phished. And so if you have Edge or Chrome generate your password and store it in your password manager, if you go to a phishing site, it's not going to get filled. And so you're going to be like, well, that's weird. My password manager is broken. And hopefully at that point, you're like, well, actually, that URL looks a little bit wonky. Maybe I'll just go to the site my normal way. And so, password managers are good strategy, but passkeys are way stronger. We have things like two-factor auth, where somebody will send you they'll give you a code, or you have the authenticator app, and you type the code from the app into your device. But those are not phish-proof, and so things where you're retyping a code from your device into the browser, there's no phishing protection there, and so like the common phish kits now will just proxy that over. And so if you get to a Windows Live Phish, you type in your Microsoft account, and then it's like, hey, well, what's your code from your app? And if you type your code from the app, the bad guy in the middle is like, okay, now I got the code, and now I've got a second factor. Whereas things like passkeys, you're not typing. Basically, the browser is looking and saying, hey, that's not the legit domain for this credential, so I'm not going to release that credential. And there's no way for the user to be like, no, it looks good to me, go ahead and do it. Like, it just doesn't work. And so those kinds of technologies, I think, are in some ways the best choices. The challenge with them, of course, is that there's adoption. Sites have to go use passkeys. They have to use WebAuthn to get this new flow. Historically, one of the challenges was getting things to work properly if you had more than one computer, your computer and your phone. And this is something that Passkeys solves pretty nicely, where basically your credentials become available across your devices, but only within your devices, so that you as a human can't get suckered into doing the wrong thing. And so that's a great protection. And if passkeys, were universally adopted, I don't think that the web defense team would have URL reputation. I mean, there's still malware, but from a phishing point of view, we wouldn't care, because there's no need to worry about it. But because passwords remain a thing and will remain a thing for years to come, we have to do more. And so there's a bunch of stuff in terms of protections. And browsers can do things like make it more obvious to users where they're logging in and providing additional information, integrating real-time reputation services like Smart Screen or Safe Browsing in the case of Google. So there's a bunch of stuff that we have to do, but it's certainly an interesting problem space, and it continues to be one. All these years later.
So I know that developers are not obviously the only ones who care about this. Obviously, end users do as well. If you think about what's available there, for example, if we take a look at what GitHub has recently claimed, so they're enforcing basically 2FA, and hopefully to have this. I say hopefully because we'll see how it goes, but by the end of 2023, anyone committing code to GitHub.com will require 2FA as part of their login process or authentication process, which I think is a good thing. I think we start with developers, you make it commonplace, and then they start thinking about making these sort of common improvements to their software that they're writing. And then secondly to that, obviously, I'm a fan of 1Password, and I know that they've blogged about this, that they're looking at passkeys as well. And they say the best password you have is the one that you don't know. And that's why I use a password manager. So what are your thoughts on some of the improvements there? I mean, I know it's slow and incremental. Do you wish it would go faster? I mean, like, you want users to be protected, obviously, but we can only go so quickly.
I would love to stop doing this job and go find something fun to do. On one hand, I would love for this, and certainly I've been a big proponent of sites, taking passkeys. I've written some blog posts. I've gone to yell at people. I've made fun of people for not having secure software. The GitHub one is actually interesting. One of the guys who's responsible, I believe he's still doing it, for that implementation actually was one of my peers when I worked in Chrome security. And so Lucas and I were together, and he ended up going off to Microsoft, to GitHub to work on their login flow with WebAuthn and stuff. And so they've been an early adopter of a lot of this stuff, and it's super great to see it. They've got a challenging space in some respects, because there's so many different ways that you end up integrating with GitHub, not only from the website but also Git and Git push and things like that. But on the other hand, they've got a somewhat easier job than some sites, in the sense of they're not like a federated network of a whole bunch of stuff. It's like GitHub.com, and maybe there's a couple others that I don't know about and never used, but they're not necessarily as complex a scenario as like Microsoft or a Google, where there's hundreds of different products, and they sometimes interact with each other, sometimes they don't. And so not every site is going to necessarily have a super hard job. Not every site is going to have a super easy job. But yeah, absolutely, I would love to see more sites adopt these kinds of technologies, so that users don't have to worry. And that being said, there's always going to be more attacks. So basically, I've got a series of blog posts around the tactics and techniques that sites are using or that phishers are using to attempt to evade things like smart screen and safe browsing URL reputation services. And URL reputation services are based around the idea that for the user to get phished, they've been lured to go visit some URL. Well, as a phisher, one way that you avoid those problems is you avoid using a URL. And sometimes it's a blended attack via telephone. So you'll get an invoice in your email, and it's like, hey, we've renewed your Windows Defender subscription for $300,
Yep.
and if you want to cancel, call the following phone number. Well, the user is out of their computer at that point. They're not, using their computer anymore. And the cellular phones, some of them have kind of scam warnings, but usually their scam warnings are against incoming calls, not outgoing calls. And bad guys also have other techniques for trying to get around malicious numbers and things like that. But these are the sorts of things that bad guys are getting forced to. So even if we manage to get credentials out of the login flows and so forth, bad guys aren't going to give up. One of the things that made the paper recently is there's an AI voice generation where if you've got your voice on the internet, say you're running a popular, I don't know, podcast on deployment technologies, and there's a bunch of hours of your voice out there, people can go dump your podcast into a generator and come up with the John voice. And then they can use whatever information they have to go, call your family members and be like, hey, it's John, and I lost my phone, and I need you to wire me a bunch of money right away to bail myself out of jail or whatever. And your loved ones are like, oh my god, I better go send the money. So like, bad guys are always going to have somewhere to go, but certainly I would love to advance the state of the art to the point where they're not just like, here's a link, please click it and type your password, and people are like, okay. I'd like to raise the bar. I'd like to raise the cost of attackers, and basically help find a way to make these attacks less profitable, so that their incidence declines.
I recently interviewed Troy Hunt for this show, and we were talking obviously about Have I Been Pwned. Do you feel like we need more services like that to help users be aware, like credentials are lost, or not necessarily credentials, but certainly anything PII related? Um, and do you think do you see an explosion of services like that coming to market?
Uh, you know, One of the things that I get to a couple of times in my blog posts over the years is that economics rules everything around us. And when it's not necessarily quickly. So like, Have I been pwned is a great example where I don't think Troy is making much money on it, if at all, directly, and spending some amount of money. Although I understand he gets a pretty good deal from Cloudflare or whoever, but in general, services come to market and continue to exist over long periods of time if there's some profitable way to do so. And so when you look at the explosion of security companies that are out there that are offering security services, the reason they're doing that is because, protection against cybercrime is big, big, big business, tens, hundreds
Yeah.
of billions of dollars. And so as a consequence, the question isn't quite so much about whether or not these services need to exist or are these services valuable. It's, will companies and individuals pay for these services? And I think the answer is there's significant evidence that they would. And it gets into this totally fascinating question. Like, one of the features that we have today, Microsoft has beyond our security business, we also have a rather significant operating system business. It's not quite as great a story as it used to be, but Microsoft still makes tons of money from Windows, selling it to
Hmm.
companies, mostly selling to companies. And we do have facilities in Windows to go passwordless, where users are not, typing a Windows password to get into their machine. Like, they can basically turn off passwords and go passwordless. And so, when you look at an organization, one approach is to say, oh, well, use some third-party security feeds, threat intelligence feeds, try and find the sites that are trying to phish your users, or turn on passwordless, and then your users can't get phished anymore. And so, on one hand, from an economic perspective, the answer certainly seems really easy. Well, just turn off passwords. But it turns out these things are non-trivial because, oh, we need to interact with this legacy system, or, oh, yeah, but what if the user's not on a modern client? It's bring your own device. I can't have proof that the device is the correct device. I need a way for users to get in. And so, none of these things are super simple. But I would say that the in terms of what exists, it's largely comes down to, well, what are folks willing to pay for, and also what does it cost to do it. And so certainly, when you look at a security product that's scanning your email, trying to find phishing emails, generally the security vendor is making those decisions based on, in part, threat intelligence, and URL reputation would be a form of threat intelligence. Well, where are they getting that threat intelligence from, and how much are they paying for it? And is that threat intelligence good? Because your security is only, your security filters are only going to be as good as your threat intelligence is. So even if your email scanner is great enough to find a link, no matter how it's been encoded, obfuscated, buried, put it as an image in a PDF file that it's attached, whatever. Like, even if you're great, you can fully extract that URL. If you don't have the threat intelligence to say, oh, and that one's malicious, then you're not getting the protection. And the threat intelligence companies get paid basically to provide those threat intel feeds. Well, depending on what they're charging for those feeds, that's going to greatly impact the profitability of your security solution. And so a lot of vendors then try to do first party threat intelligence where they gain their own. But that becomes one of those things where if you have more market share, if you're seeing more traffic, you have better intel. And so that's, kind of gets into the same way of like, why was Google great, back 2006, 2007? They crawled more of the web faster. They had bigger data. They had more data. And so, that's one of the other pieces that gets into this whole economics of the security business game is how much intelligence do you have? Where are you getting it from? How fresh is it? So, yeah, I don't know. I been pwned specifically. I think it's a super cool service, like both technically because Troy did such a great job of kind of talking about how it works and so forth. And personally, I think it's useful to periodically hear about accounts that had 15 or 20 years ago that got breached, and it's like, oh yeah, I better not use that password. But even that like is one of those fascinating things that becomes its own source of attack, right? And so one of the scams that's relatively common, I haven't seen one in a couple of months at this point, but bad guy will send you an email and say, hey, e_Lawrence at hotmail.com. I have your password, and it's this string. And I use this password to hack into your computer and hack your webcam. And, I have videos of you in your house and you didn't know I was there. And I'm going to blackmail you and extort you. And if you don't send me money, well, obviously this is all completely made up. The password that they have, I used on like a newspaper site in 2003, never used anywhere else. It's never been my Windows password or whatever, but it provides a veneer of authenticity. And if you're someone who uses the same password on every site, it could be believable.
Yeah.
It's like, oh my gosh, like they do have my password. And so one of the things about those, you read that email, the first one, you're like, oh my gosh. And then you look at the password, you're like, this is garbage. And you delete it. You get the second one and you're like, oh, this is obvious garbage. And you just don't worry about it anymore. But one of the things that's super fascinating about this particular attack is sometimes the guys are lazy and they'll say, send one Bitcoin, or now that Bitcoins are 20 grand, like send zero point 0.1 Bitcoin or whatever to the following address. And some of these guys are lazy and use the same address in every email. Well, Bitcoin's a public blockchain. So you can go type that Bitcoin address into one of the ledger lookups and see that people have sent money. People are falling for this scam. And so, it's one of those things where it's, you're using, this, some people have this misunderstanding that Bitcoin is somehow an untraceable currency. It's not. It's a perfectly traceable currency. It's the most traceable currency that's ever existed. And you're using that fact to spy on the bad guys and understand what's going on. But yeah, lots of fun stuff.
I like the technique where people will annotate their email addresses with basically you give it A plus symbol. That's right. Yes. And what is the technical name for that? Is there one?
I don't. I've never heard a name for it, and I
Yeah.
don't know that anybody other than Google implemented it. But yeah,
Mm.
so if you have your email address, then plus, and then you can be like whoever you gave the email out to, a super lazy fisher, or a scammer who picks up that address, doesn't know about that. The other one that's kind of funny is the position of dots in Gmail addresses doesn't matter. So you can be e.ric, and that'll be the same as Eric at. But the plus trick is useful to sort of understand the origins.
Hmm.
The sad part is that if you're not a totally lazy bad guy, you know this about Gmail.
I look at the work that you and Troy are doing, and it's a collection of, I guess, white hats who are educating the public about things. And I know that you do this on your blog and also on your Twitter account. Uh, it must just never stop amazing you at how clever folks are getting now with the sort of ways to try and circumvent people, with these sort of clever sort of URL munging and things like that. So I mean, it must never stop. I mean, for doing these things. Obviously, it's a bad example, but you know where I'm getting at, right? Like, are you always surprised by what the attackers are coming up with these days?
I you know I would say actually mostly I'm depressed at what they're coming up with because
Okay, sorry.
most of what they're doing is not actually terribly interesting or exciting. I do think though it is a bit of an indictment in our um, as a security community our sort of inability to protect,
Mm,
and this is one of the things that's kind of fascinating. So going way back to the very early days of the kind of new security world, circa 2005 2006. We started to kind of increase the prominence and visibility of HTTPS in Internet Explorer. And back then, certificates were expensive. They were hard to get from most companies. They took a bunch of time. And so, if a site had a certificate, there was a very high probability that that site was legitimate. But that was sort of that kind of fell apart. And the reason that it fell apart was some of the certificate authorities looked at the actual requirements for certificate issuance and they said, oh, we don't actually need to do all this stuff that VeriSign is doing that they charge $700 for. We can do this for
yeah.
like $12. And so suddenly getting a certificate went from $700 to $12. Well, from a security point of view, that's absolutely a great thing. You want all traffic to be secure. But one of the heuristics that humans had went away. And so one of the examples that was under great discussion back then, there's a bank called Bank of the West. And somebody got a certificate for Bank of the West, where instead of the W being a W, it was two V's adjacent to each other. And so it looked considerably like a W. And that was the example that people put together and said, oh man, you got to be really careful with your new SSL UX that you're not over promising what SSL is providing because this is a legit phishing site that has a cert. And so back then, that was kind of some of the early days of the how do you make URLs look like other URLs. There were other things around. We introduced international domain names, the ability to use URLs that were not written purely in ASCII. Well, this is super problematic because Cyrillic, for instance, has a bunch of characters that look identical to ASCII characters. So if you build out your domain, replace one of the C's with the Cyrillic one, get a certificate for it. Now it looks exactly like the real Microsoft website, except there's a Cyrillic C instead of the ASCII C. And so, that was when I felt like there was a lot of the cleverness of things. Most of what I see now is not in any way clever. And, it gets back to like the example that was just there. It was like help-coinbase.com. Help-coinbase.com is not hard to get. An elementary schooler can go get that and be like, oh, okay, I'm help.coinbase.com. Or help-coinbase.com, not dot. And that's one of the things that's super subtle about URLs. Oh, if it was a dot, it would have been okay, but if it's a dash, it's bad. It's like, what? And so, like, having users understand what URLs mean and how to interpret the URLs is just absolutely not the way to go. And my former teammates in the Chrome security team, Emily Stark in particular, they have a bunch of things about like why URLs inherently hard. But even beyond that, like even beyond that idea of I present to you the human URL and you make a security decision based on that URL, there's a huge body of people who have no understanding whatsoever that the URL is even relevant. And so some of the research that we did back in the Internet Explorer days around our UX, we found that a very, I mean, very non-significant, I think it was like 12% or something, of people had no understanding whatsoever of what the address bar was. They never ever even looked at it. They just used the content area of the web page and they trusted whatever it told them. And so, no matter what you were doing around highlighting the domain or drawing attention to what is the real top level domain or effective first level domain, wouldn't matter. They just did not have the mental model where that was relevant. And so, yeah, I would say that nowadays most of the phishing stuff, not a significant degree of cleverness in most cases. I think that it's really become sort of a commoditized thing. People aren't writing their own phishing sites anymore; they're buying fish kits. People aren't hosting their own infrastructure anymore; they're borrowing infrastructure. The past few months, I've been getting a ton of Navy Federal Credit Union phishing sites. All of them are hosted on Glitch, so they're not even buying their own infrastructure. And it'll be like Glitch is an online coding site where you can like throw up your own stuff and play with it. And their auto-generated domains are just three random words, like back in the old days. Wow, I'm really dating myself, but like, basically, because I think AOL or CompuServe did this at some point for you just pick three random words and you stuck them together, and so it'll be like, you know, freaky squirrel music dot glitch dot co or whatever, and it'll
Yeah.
be a Navy Federal page, right? Like this is purely targeted, and the fact that they keep doing it suggests that they're getting more than zero hits. And so, there's no relationship. They're not doing anything clever. They're not, doubling up characters and things like that. But for the places where people have tried to get clever, the double characters and things like that, browsers have started to get a little bit better. And so both Chrome and Edge have a feature that they call typo squat prevention. And the idea of typo squat prevention is it looks at the URL and there's a list of known sort of legitimate URLs. And it basically analyzes the URL and says, does that look like something that the user might be trying to legitimately get to, and is it too close? And if so, we'll ask the user, did you mean to go here rather than here? And there's some false positives in that approach. Some of them are absolutely comical. Right now, I think GitHub's raw file download thing, like raw.github.io, right now has a false positive where it's like, did you mean to go
Uh,
here? Like,
yeah.
yeah. But uh,
Yeah.
and that's the challenge with this, right? Like there's a bunch of ideas that we could do in the browser that would improve security, but would be noisy and would be annoying to people potentially. And so you have to get that balance just right, where you're not, freaking out over the wrong things, and you're doing a good job. And you have to be fast. Like a lot of these phishing sites do not live for more than a few hours anyway. So if you're not able to ingest threat intel that says this is a dangerous site and actually end up getting the block out within a couple hours, you may as well not even bother because the site won't be live for that long. And so there's a bunch of cool tech in the works and just shipped already. And so one of the things that I was sort of compelled to mention because it's a product of my team is Windows 11 has a phishing sensor. So the Windows 11 phishing sensor basically has the capability of if you type your Windows login password into Windows in a place where it shouldn't be, we will tell you, hey, you just typed your password in somewhere it shouldn't be. You probably want to change your password. And so the phishing sensor, will warn you if you go type your password into Notepad. It'll just be like, Notepad's not a great place to store your passwords. Maybe not do that. But if you type it into a phishing site, no matter what browser you're using, we will tell you. And so Windows will basically, if you get phished in Chrome, Windows will say, hey, you just typed your password into a phishing site in Chrome. Even though we're not in Chrome, we're in Windows. And so there's some sort of out of the box thinking and features that we're doing around that are interesting for sure.
I'm never going to go on the internet again after this. You've convinced me that's not worth doing.
It's 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 sometimes it is scary, and the numbers that you hear are scary. And I think the thing that is most scary is hearing about breaches that have started in fairly innocuous ways, where somebody, they got phished, and oh, they realized that they got phished like an hour later, but by then the bad guys had already abused that credential and logged in and used various tactics and techniques to get beyond that initial beachhead and attack the rest of the organization and things like that. And those are the stories where you're like, oh man, that is not good. And so, like, yeah, there's lots of scare stuff, but also, the other point to be made about some of this is, the security business is tens of billions to hundreds of billions of dollars a year. There are people that are greatly incented to make sure that everybody hears about all these horrible things that are happening, because that's basically the sales pitch for their company, the sales pitch for their product. And, this is just a product of the world that we live in, too. Like, economics rules everything. And people are attracted to stories about horrible things happening. And so, there was a terrible earthquake on the other side of the world a few, about a month ago or something. And it's like, somebody asked, why do these awful things, why did they suddenly start happening? And it's like, no, there have been awful earthquakes all around the world for all of time, but he didn't have instant, man on the scene, video camera or smartphone camera footage going around and being on CNN within an hour of it happening before. It used to be, you get the dispatch in the newspaper. Last month there was a terrible earthquake and it was really bad, and you just could just kind of shrug and be like, oh well, that's unfortunate. Whereas now it's like front page news. And so, I think that it is in some cases easy to get caught up in kind of the negative view of everything is terrible and it's not getting better, and miss the fact that actually things are getting better and there's a lot of promising stuff on the horizon. And we definitely need to keep up the pressure and keep pressuring people to say, hey, you need stronger technology, and do it in a way that makes sense. I mean, the thing that's totally bananas to me right now is ordering a burrito at Chipotle has a higher security requirement than logging into my brokerage where 90% of my money is. Like, it's just crazy. Like, I can go log into my brokerage and move money around, move huge amounts of money around with a lower security posture than, I want to buy a $6 burrito from Chipotle in the app. And it's like, that's just crazy to me. And I hope that that is the kind of thing that we focus on, of improving things and increasing security. And there's some super smart thinkers I follow, and one of the guys that I follow kind of makes this point of, like, you generally don't want perfect security. Perfect security is annoying. What you want is, you want security to be good enough that it becomes uneconomical for bad guys to cause bad things to happen in a broad way, such that basically, even if you could attack it, it's like, well, we're never going to make any money doing that, and the risk is too high that we're going to get caught and get thrown off in prison or whatever. So we're not even going to bother. And that, I think, is the model that we have to take for these things, of thinking about risk, thinking about the relative safety and security of things. And to your point of, like, never getting on the internet again, like, it's certainly, people could have that reaction. My parents, I think, have a very balanced reaction. They do a bunch of stuff on the internet, but they will not do anything involving a bank on the internet. They will not log into the bank. They will not check their balance. They will not do anything. And for them, that is a very good threat model, because the bank is literally a 4-minute walk from their front door. And so they can just walk over and talk to the banker, and they're never going to get phished. There's never going to be a Macedonian that, like, erects a new bank right next to their one and puts on a more convincing sign, and they accidentally walk into that one. Like, that's just not going to happen. And so, from a threat model point of view, that, I think, is a good trade off.
Let's talk a little bit about Fiddler. I think we've scared people enough. So, as I mentioned in the start of this show, you are the creator of Fiddler, which I have to say is probably it's definitely a core tool in my toolbox or tool belt as a developer these days. And I say that, I'm not being facetious when I say that. I am 100% dedicated to this tool. So thank you. But the reason why I say that is because I think that too oftentimes people, like, we're all building connected applications and they're all using pretty much HTTP, which is the ubiquitous protocol for everything. And so I think that Fiddler is essential if you're going to build anything that's connected to the internet, which, let's face it, is everything. So I want to start by asking you about, the first question I had is, did you ever imagine when you started Fiddler? I know the backstory for Fiddler, and folks, I won't chew up too much time, but you basically created this as a way to help you debug clip art, as you mentioned earlier at the start of the show. You were on the clip art team, and it's funny, we did some crazy things back in the day when we were targeting Windows, NT 3.1 or 3.5 rather, and we'd use the beep command and stuff just to figure out what's going on. But you needed this to basically trace the network, and since then it's grown. So my question is, like, did you ever imagine this thing would be as popular as it is now when you started out? Like, did you ever envision this as the future of this tool?
No, like it's kind of funny. Like, yeah, the backstory for Fiddler I've told a million times in a million venues, but yeah, it was for debugging clip art. I literally replaced something that I had hacked together that was a console thing that dropped all the traffic to the console. And if you drop an ASCII 7, which is pretty prevalent in binary clip art, to the console, it'll ding the system speaker. And so people were burning out their speakers debugging clip art with this other tool that I wrote. That's basically where Fiddler came from. No, I certainly had no vision that Fiddler was going to get as big as it did until, probably 5 years after, the first version, where I was kind of like, oh, that actually kind of worked out pretty good. I did think that, HTTP had a future. Like, it did seem reasonable rather than building a one-off thing for debugging clip art. Like, there would have been approaches where, oh, I'm going to like hook the clip art client and do some function level debugging or function stuff like that. But I felt like, oh well, HTTP seems like it could be useful for something other than debugging clip art. But definitely, I kind of thought HTTP had peaked. Like, I thought we were sort of like, we'd seen everything we were going to see with HTTP, and it wasn't going to be as big as it was.
So just to interrupt you for a second here, what year was that? Like, I just want to set the context for folks.
So I had started working on Fiddler now you got me on the spot. And I can't remember whether it was 2003 or 2004. I think it was
Let's
2000.
say early 2000s. Let's say early 2000s. So you thought HTTP. So let me just. I want to make sure that people's ears are working correctly. You thought HTTP had peaked at early 2000s.
Yeah,
I love it.
2003 was HTTP was about as big as it was going to get. I mean, to be fair, like, we had a great web browser, an Internet Explorer 6, and it had pretty much vanquished the other browser, Netscape. And so, yeah, HTTP seemed important. And, we had the Office clients that were doing a bunch of HTTP traffic, but, it just didn't feel like it was going to be much bigger than that.
I'm not making fun of you. I said no one's going to buy the iPhone when it first got announced.
It's definitely a thing where, I kind of felt like this was worth doing, but I didn't have any vision of it becoming more prominent. I think that the one thing, like, if you chart, this is part of it, right? Like, God, I could talk for hours about everything. One of the things, there's a guy, I think it was Corey House, who has this talk about increase your Lux surface area. And one of the ways that you can increase your Lux surface area is by building stuff. And if you build stuff in areas that turn out to be fruitful, it goes well. And so HTTP is an area that turned out to be pretty important. And so having an HTTP debugger turned out to go pretty well. And, I did continue
Yes.
to invest, but it was always a single person investment. There was nobody else working on Fiddler. And so HTTP turned out to be really important. Fiddler turned out to be important. But some of the things were unpredictable. Like, Fiddler has an extreme amount of extensibility, not because I am a genius platform developer, but because when I started Fiddler, I didn't know what I was doing. And I figured, well, if I build a bunch of hooks, maybe people smarter than me can hook up the rest of it. And so that was one reason for it. Literally, Fiddler has a script engine because our bug tracker tool in 2003 at Microsoft was this really complicated series of combo boxes and text boxes. And I couldn't figure out how to build that. And I was like, wouldn't it be so much better if you could just write a little bit of like script or something that says what you wanted and it would show it and hide it? And then I came across an article that was like, build a script engine in .NET. And I was like, oh, like, it's literally 20 lines to add a script engine to your .NET app? Okay. And so that's where Fiddler script came from. But in terms of like impact, the thing that has the greatest, probably the greatest impact on me in terms of like, wow, I did not see that coming, was one of the NoSQL databases. I can't remember which one it was. I want to say RavenDB, but it could have been one of the other ones. I was at a DevSum conference, so I was giving a talk in Sweden, in Stockholm, not something I ever predicted about Fiddler. And one of the other speakers mentioned that they had chosen HTTP for their transport because then they wouldn't have to write a debugger. They just use Fiddler. And that was like, whoa, that is not something I would have seen coming a million years ago. And so that's kind of the backstory. The one thing I will say, HTTP certainly continues to be very important. Fiddler, pretty important tool. You can do a bunch of stuff with it. But working in the browser, one of the things about the browser is the browser has Fiddler is an HTTP 1.1 debugger. And it turns out that's good enough for almost everything because most clients, if they go through a proxy that doesn't support HTTP2 or HTTP3, they will just fall back to HTTP 1.1. And so you can debug almost everything with Fiddler even today. But if you're a browser engineer trying to debug Chrome or Edge, and you actually are trying to test something related to HTTP2 or HTTP3, if you put Fiddler in the middle, you're now down to HTTP 1.1 and your repro might disappear. And so one of the very cool things about Chromium is Chromium has an export format. So if you go chrome://net export, it can export a low level traffic dump in a JSON format. Well, that's super useful. You can see very low level detail that reads and writes on HTTP2 sockets and information about how DNS was done and connection pooling, all this other information. It's super cool. But the visualization of that is hyper nerdy. Well, one of the things that since I left, since I came back to Microsoft a couple of years ago, is now I've written an importer for that format into Fiddler. So you don't even have to have your debugging buddy, install Fiddler to get a trace. You just have them generate that JSON file and send it to you. And then in Fiddler, you can do file import and then do Chromium netcap or netlog and load it in. And that was possible because back at the beginning, I didn't know what I was doing. So I made an extension model for importers. And so even though I no longer have access to the Fiddler source code, I can't improve Fiddler, I can write extensions for it. And so there's an extension for the netlog importer for Fiddler. And it's open source, it's on my GitHub. And periodically I add to it. And sometimes engineers are like, oh, it'd be great if I could see the certificates in a more friendly way rather than trying to like save them to a file and blah, blah, blah. And so I've continued to enhance that. And so even though I am no longer on the Fiddler team at Telerik, and even though Telerik is basically not really investing in the classic desktop version of Fiddler, any longer. Fiddler is getting better because you can still write extensions, you can write plugins, and you can add new integrations that weren't there before.
Yeah, the version of Fiddler I use is Fiddler Everywhere. I'm absolutely in love with it because I'm obviously on a Mac, and the fact that it gives me pretty much everything I need in order to be dangerous in a good way with this. I would almost say that it's almost a shame that a lot of folks, like the more developers I meet, and I meet a lot of developers all the time, it's like they tend to forget. Like I'm amazed by how much that they just rely upon the HTTP client they have, and they don't bother looking at the headers or what compression algorithm is specified or um, what sort of like are you sending the right HTTP headers relative to your encoding, or what's the size of your requests, or it just bonkers my mind. It boggles my mind that developers don't take the time to understand all that, because I live my life in that, especially when talking to services. I'm like, hey, this is wrong. We didn't send a text/JSON or whatever, or we're not using Brotli. We should be using Brotli, or
Yep.
why is this coming as a post as opposed to a put? Like, even the knowledge of all the 19 or so verbs we have in HTTP, it's like there just seems to be a lot of knowledge lacking there. Would you say like a tool like Fiddler is a great learning tool for folks to understand HTTP better?
Certainly, it was the intent of Fiddler to make it as easy as Outlook. And that is literally, if you just do a bubble diagram of what Fiddler is, it's Outlook. On the left hand side, there's a list of messages. You click on a message, and on the right hand side, you see the message. I am not a fantastic UI designer. This is just the most obvious thing to build. And so, yes, the goal for Fiddler from a design point of view was you start the tool, you see stuff happening, and you click around until you learn stuff. And there's other tools where you have to like set configuration parameters and filters and other stuff to like really you have to know what you're doing in order to do it. Whereas the goal of Fiddler was to just make it easy. And so one of the things you said is like there's a lot of knowledge lacking, and maybe that it's hard to understand why developers aren't doing these things. And it's actually super easy to understand. Developers have a job trying to get the job done, and then they want to move on to the next thing on the backlog. One of the goals of Fiddler was to make bugs obvious and make bugs solvable because they're visible. It's very hard as humans to do anything about something that you cannot see. And the goal of Fiddler is to make things visible. And sometimes it's visible and prominent. So, like if you have an HTTP protocol error, like you're sending something that's not HTTP, Fiddler has the ability to pop up a dialog and be like, by the way, this URL or this request is just malformed and it's going to be your problem. And here's what it is. It also has linters where it can do more advanced things where you're like, hey, something weird is happening. I want you to be really pedantic and tell me about these things. And so a lot of this functionality is in the desktop, the classic Windows version. And so the Windows version, if you're interested in things like compression, I wrote a plugin for Fiddler called Compressibility, where you grab all of your traffic lists and you drop it on compressibility, and it will go compress it using every version of gzip, deflate, and broadly. And then for images, WebP and Ping and optimized Ping or whatever, and JPEG, and then tell you how much traffic size you could save. There is at the top of that list another one, getting back to the make bugs visible. There's a plugin called Show Image Bloat. And this was one I wrote back when I was at Telerik that will literally analyze images going through Fiddler and look for metadata bloating, and then draw a brick wall over the percentage of the image that is a result of metadata bloating. And nowadays, this doesn't turn up a whole lot. But back in 2015, it was bananas. You would go to the Hotmail login page, and 90% of the thing would be this brick wall. And you look it up, and you realize the background image was a 1.3 megabyte JPEG. But of the 1.3 megabyte JPEG, only 200K was JPEG. 1.1 megabyte was Adobe metadata saying, here's all the parameters that the designer who used this was set in their editor. And you would go across major websites and see entire brick walls over the whole thing.
Yep.
This is one of those things where asking a developer, hey, I need you to go like analyze the quality of images, and it's okay, I'm going to go download this, write some cron jobs to go into like ImageMagick and analyze, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, that's not any fun. How about tick the checkbox that says, does the brick wall thing? And then like, you can have that on and you can surf around. And this is the way that I surf the internet. I would just drive around the internet and I'd see these brick walls. And occasionally, if they were particularly egregious, I'd go troll people on Twitter. I think there was a period of time where I was doing this so much that Steve Souders stopped following me. He's like, there's too many brick walls.
Yeah, that story reminds me of this presentation I saw a while ago called the Website Obesity Crisis. And I termed images like the high fructose corn syrup of the internet, basically, because they are just killing the bandwidth that we have, the limited amount of bandwidth we have available. So, and for those folks who don't know who Steve Souders is, he's the Google. He's still at Google? I wasn't sure.
He's at Fastly, although I think now
okay.
He's consultant for Fastly. I think he's probably on a beach somewhere. But yeah, he was at Google, high performance websites and even more high performance websites.
Yes. And one of the things that they did was they did the web page they did web page testing where they did the HP archive aggregate, and they were doing reports on how big the internet was, basically. And it's like following the trend lines of world population obesity crisis. We've got the same kind of crisis right now, but these are fantastic extensions. Sorry.
Yeah, you know the other thing to keep in mind is well, actually maybe on your island, your network performance might not be as amazing as mine. You know, I have 940 megabit fiber in my house or whatever, but you know the performance characteristics that people in high bandwidth areas see sometimes mask problems. And you know the example that I use a bunch on this is my local movie theater. I noticed that on my phone, the movie poster for the movie that I wanted to see did not appear instantly. It took a second or two, and I thought, well, that's a little bit weird.
Mm.
Let me go look at this in Fiddler. Their movie poster was a 64 megabyte JPEG. Like if you loaded this thing in like VP9 or HEVC, the movie would have been smaller than the movie poster. But it was a 64 megabyte JPEG, and they literally had no knowledge that this was happening. Well, for me, whatever. I see a 1 second delay in my page loading. I go on about my day. But if you think about places that don't have that kind of connectivity, there's no way you're going to use this. And this happens all over the place. I remember back when I did a hack in the box presentation over in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and I
Mm.
loaded some Microsoft web page. It was like the partner portal, and this page took 45 seconds to load, and I was like,
Wow.
what? And the problem was there was a drop down, which was like, which company are you with? And this drop
It
down
was
had
loading that?
800,000
Oh.
entries in it or something, and it wasn't compressed. And so this page took 45 seconds to load, whereas in Redmond, it would not have been an eighth of a second. And so you got to think about like if you want to have a worldwide web, as it were, like you need to think about the performance characteristics, and you need to think about like even in the United States, there's people who pay for data on their phones. And so, you know, if you're just peddling to rich consumers on high bandwidth plans on iPhones, that's one thing. But if you want to get the guy who's got, you know, the cheapest T-Mobile plan with a data cap, like don't send a 64 megabyte movie poster. And it's easy to kind of point the finger at the dev and be like, bad dev, no cookie. But wouldn't it be much better if the browser or a tool like Fiddler just told you, by the way, you've done messed up? And so I'm a huge proponent of building tools that make it so we can fault developers because they did know and they just didn't care. Like if your tool reaches out and taps you on the shoulder and says, by the way, that's a 64 megabyte JPEG, maybe don't do that. And you're like, yeah, whatever, I don't care. That's on you as a developer. But if the designer gave you the 64 meg, you had to get it out, drag, drop, you're done, you're off to have your dinner. I can't fault the dev too much for that.
Yeah, I use Fiddler more as kind of like a personal fuzzer for testing out our APIs, and I'll propagate some ungodly like values you would never expect coming through, just to
Yep.
see how our API handles things. And I love the composer window in Fiddler for that. It just allows me to basically mess with APIs and for not for nefarious reasons, but to
Yeah.
say like, hey, what happens if we do X or Y?
Have you used the Scratchpad tab? Do you know what the Scratchpad
Yes,
tab is? Okay, yeah. So the
yes,
Scratchpad tab I built entirely for developer evangelists because I saw the SQL developer evangelists that have that cool query tool where you just like highlight some stuff and say run. And I was
yep.
like, I want that for HTTP. So I went off and built that for HTTP. Have you used the API test tool in Fiddler?
I don't think that one's available in a Fiddler everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably not. So that was one of the ones that, in hindsight, I should have spent way more time on. You know, one of the funny bits about Fiddler that's kind of interesting was, you know, I sold Fiddler off to Telerik and you know did pretty well with it, but you know my conclusion was there was no money in this HTTP debugging space. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the company Postman.
Oh, absolutely.
Postman came about, you know, at the time, you know, roughly when I left Microsoft was when Postman started to sort of enter the scene for real. And I was like, oh, cute. It's like a baby little fiddler. Postman is a multi-billion-dollar company
I
with
know.
hundreds of
They
thousands of employees.
Fiddler is Fiddler and Postman would be. I look at Postman and I'm like, they're targeting very similar sort of spaces. But you're absolutely right. Postman is a massive and for good reason. They've got a wonderful set of products.
Yeah. And they found something that they could make money at that people are willing to pay for. And API test in Fiddler, like the whole time, going back to 2004, 2005, I was like, yeah, you can do API testing with Fiddler, it's fine. But I never went and built anything for it. And so over a period of a month or two at Fiddler, I built an API test plugin for Fiddler desktop. And so you can have test cases and you can run them. It's about the simplest API test thing that you can imagine, where you basically put in your stuff, what you expect to get, push the button. If it's all green, you're great. And if anything turned red, you have a regression and you go look at it. And I think you could have built, a very similar business to what Postman ended up doing in that vein on Fiddler, but I never did. So, oops.
Hey, we can't win them all. Postman's definitely interesting in that sense because they've taken into account the fact that people work in teams and you can share collections and things of that nature. And I really like Postman a lot. So the fact that you mentioned them, it makes me feel better that I'm following the right trends now. If you're saying that they're one to look at, so are you still active in the Fiddler space?
Only in a few ways. So earlier you had the website for the Fiddler book. I realized with some degree of alarm from like one of those Google Photos memories thing.
I brought that up for an intention. I didn't want to promote Telerik right off the bat. I wanted to promote your book right off the bat.
So that book is now 8 years old, which is just totally bananas to me because I feel like it was yesterday. But it's also still almost completely accurate for Fiddler on desktop. It's not for Fiddler Everywhere. Fiddler Everywhere did not exist, but it does cover a lot of the same ground of the sort of the principles behind how Fiddler works. But that book's now 8 years old. And so I've considered doing a third edition, but I'm kind of like, well, now that I don't have the ability to add a new menu option that's like, go buy my book, I don't know how many copies I'm going to sell. But I do still write a fair amount of answers or help articles or bugs for Telerik to look at for Fiddler. But the main thing is around code. And so, as I mentioned, I wrote the compressibility extension a couple of years ago, and I wrote the netlog import feature for the importer. And so I do a fair number of extensions and other things to make Fiddler better for Fiddler for desktop. And I still answer a fair number of questions. People at Microsoft are like, "Oh, I'm having this problem with Fiddler," and I was like, "I could probably help you with that." And I'll usually help them. And then, like 3 or 4 days later, they'll come back and they're like, "Wait a minute, did you write Fiddler?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I did." And so that's always fun. But yeah, so I'm still involved, and I hassle the folks at Telerik once in a while to take a bug fix or whatnot. But it is one of those things where perfect hindsight 2020. It's like,
Sure.
oh man, I should have open sourced it. Like I'd still love to be making contributions. But on the other hand, like the other thing is that Fiddler at this point does most of what I need, and it has done things that are kind of surprising. And so I'll just give you one example of that real quick. Chromium-based browsers have the ability to have extensions that talk to native clients on the local computer. So if you need to do something outside of the browser sandbox, the way that you do it is use a native host executable. And the native host executable is basically something that the browser extension just opens a stream of text to the app and sends JSON formatted messages between the two of them. We had a customer about a year ago who had a problem where their native host was not working properly with their extension. And I was like, oh man, like we really need Fiddler for this. Like we need the ability to see the messages going back and forth and ideally even change them. And
Mm.
so, I was like, oh man, it was so cool. I wish I had time like that. And then I was like, but wait a minute. Like, we don't actually need a new Fiddler. We already have Fiddler. All we need is a little piece that tells this communication flow to go through Fiddler. And so in about 2 days, I built a .NET executable that is called the Native Messaging Meddler. And what you do is you stick it between your extension and your hosts. And the traffic goes into this thing and does a lightweight viewing for it. But if you want to do any interesting viewing, there's a thing that says send to Fiddler. What this does is it takes the pipe of data and sends it off to Fiddler, which is an HTTP listener sitting on your local machine. And then you can use Fiddler's inspectors to view that JSON. You can write rules that highlight JSON of interest. you can use Fiddler breakpoint debugging to breakpoint, edit the JSON, and change it between the two. And so I realized, wow, like I don't need to rewrite Fiddler. I can make it do what I want, even though I don't have the source code. And there was nothing proprietary. Anybody could do anything like this. And this was like a total revelation to me of like, oh my gosh, I didn't lose, when I left Telerik, I didn't lose access to, whatever, 13 years of work. Like I can still use it and I can still make it do new things that it just had no ability to do before. So it was pretty
Yeah,
exciting.
yeah, that's awesome. Uh, so at I'll leave you with this last question because I know that we're a little bit over time. But one of the things that excites me is kind of like where things are going. So when I look at APIs and also what's possible there, I think of we did a large evaluation of like gRPC and protocol buffers, and I know that in the next version of Fiddler Everywhere, they're planning on adding gRPC support. You see this in a lot of stacks. Like for example, I do a lot of work with Terraform, and Terraform utilizes gRPC between the client API, or sorry, the client API, which is kind of like it's basically known as a Terraform provider, and then the CLI. So there's a binary protocol that talks between the two. And the fact that I can use a tool like to your example, I can use a tool like Fiddler to kind of watch what's happening between the two environments is a godsend to me because what matters is on the wire. I actually see what UIs show me on the through their dialogues as that is a lie. What matters is what hits the wire. And so I'm really encouraged by that evolution. And where do you see the future of Fiddler going in the space that we have around API development, etc.? Like, do you see? I certainly continue to use it today. Like, I have alternatives like Postman and Wireshark and Charles Proxy and all these other things, but I still come back to Fiddler for its simplicity. Where do you see the future for that?
So the shortest answer is I don't know because the folks that I knew at Telerik that worked on it are no longer there before anymore.
Okay.
I can offer a couple of observations. One, like things like protocol buffers and gRPC were just sort of coming to prominence as I was leaving Telerik, and so there are some plugins that will allow visualization of protocol buffers within Fiddler. One of the things that was a little bit tricky is that protocol buffers are based on having a schema, and the schema is not in the buffer. And so you need some way to configure the thing to know, oh, this schema is what applies to this buffer. And it seemed like a kind of a hassle to build it. I think Charles ended up doing that, but certainly you could do that with Fiddler. People have done that with Fiddler on desktop. And so absolutely, like the goal of Fiddler was to be extensible enough to support visualization and editing anything. In terms of like where the products are going, um, I don't work at Telerik. I can say that if they have any brains at all, and I think they probably do, they looked at Fiddler, which they acquired for a sum nowhere near a $2 billion valuation of Postman, and they looked at Postman. And said, wait a minute, like we could do that. And so I would be shocked if they don't go that route. That notion of collaborative, team-based stuff with interactions and sharing and things like that. And they have leaned into that already. They have a
Mm,
variety of approaches that are being part of the reason why Fiddler was not integrated with teams and stuff like that was it would have meant that I had to write services on websites
mm.
like Azure or something, which was A, new at the time, and B, I didn't want to go learn a whole new thing. And I didn't
And,
understand.
and now coming full circle, I was just going to say, now we come full circle. That you're now part of a clip art team. You're building services, basically.
Yeah. And so it's it's building the back end. Me personally was a thing that was not there, but Telerik has people that can do that, and they've got their own cloud and stuff like that. And so like there's a lightweight version of Fiddler called Fiddler Cap that just does little SAS files locally, but they have their own thing now. It's like Fiddler Jam or something. I don't remember what it's called, but basically it has this cloud-based submission thing. So instead of the user futzing about with a local file and attaching it to email, it just all happens in the cloud and stuff like that. And so I would expect the Telerik folks to be sort of leaning into that because there's plainly, there's good evidence that there's money there. There are things that people are willing to pay for, and that economics rules everything around us. And so if they're paying attention, I would expect to see more leaning into that kind of thing.
Eric, I really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining me.
It's awesome talking to you.